Small's Paradise, the heart of Harlem. Frank Lucas sat down at the table and his hands were shaking. Across from him sat Bumpy Johnson, silent and oceanless. In front of him, an untouched glass of cognac. Bumpy didn't say anything. He just slid an envelope across the table. When Frank opened it, what fell out would be the end of his leave. As he knew it, 3 photographs, Saigon Airport. Frank shaking hands with the white man, the briefcase the man was carrying. What was inside the briefcase? Heroin. Bumpy still didn't speak. He just stared. That look told Frank everything. I've been watching you. I know every meeting. I know every connection. And now I'm giving you one choice. Either you leave Harlem or Harlem berries. Frank Lucas walked out of Small's Paradise. That night, no longer Bumpy Johnson's student. He was his enemy. But what nobody knew, what the history books won't tell you, is that Bumpy had seen this coming, and what Bumpy did in those final months before his death wasn't just about stopping Frank. It was about teaching him one last lesson. A lesson Frank would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd learned to understand what happened. That night at Small's Paradise, you need to understand who Frank Lucas was. He wasn't just another hustler. He was Bumpy Johnson's protege, his chosen son, the man Bumpy had groomed to take over Harlem when he was gone. Frank had come to Harlem, fresh from North Carolina, hungry, smart, and respectful. He'd heard the stories about Bumpy Johnson, the man who faced down at Schultz with nothing but a razor, the man who'd made Lucky Luciano negotiate instead of fight, the man who'd run Harlem without bowing to anyone. Frank had to learn from the best, and somehow impossibly Bumpy took him in. It started small. Frank drove Bumpy 2 meetings, carried messages, collected debts. Nothing glamorous, but Frank was watching everything. He weighed Bumpy, commanded a room without raising his voice, the way he settled disputes without pulling a gun, the way he made men twice his size back down with nothing but a look. Frank wasn't just a driver anymore. He was Bumpy's right hand. When Bumpy got out of Alcatraz and needed to reclaim Harlem from the traitors who'd carved it up, Frank was there, standing behind him when what put that razor to smooth Henderson's face? Standing beside him when the Genoese family tried to negotiate, learning, absorbing, becoming. Bumpy taught him everything. How to read people. How to spot a lie before it's finished being told. How to build loyalty that money can't buy. How to rule without terror, with respect instead. And most importantly, Bumpy taught him the code. The one rule that separated Harlem's underworld from the Italian mobs, from the corrupt cops, from the politicians who sold out their own people. No drugs in Harlem. Numbers, fine. That was hope. Poor. People betting nickels for a chance. Gambling, fine. That was entertainment. Protection rackets, even that was business. But heroin, cocaine, pills, anything that turned Harlem's children into zombies and Harlem's mothers into prostitutes. That was forbidden. That was betrayal. The moment you put poison in your own neighborhood, Bumpy told Frank, sitting in this exact same booth at Small's Paradise, you stop being a king and you become a parasite, and parasites get exterminated. Frank nodded, understood, believed it. For years, Frank followed that code religiously. He turned down drug deals that would have made him rich overnight. When pushers tried to set up shop on 116th Street, Frank ran them out himself. Not because Bumpy ordered him to, because he believed in the principle. Harlem wasn't for sale, not to the Italians, not to the corrupt system, and certainly not to the drug dealers who wanted to turn it into an open-air pharmacy. But somewhere, something changed. Frank started seeing the money other people were making. The Italian families were pulling in millions from heroin. The Mexican cartels were rising. The French connection was pumping pure product into New York, and everyone with a corner was getting rich. Everyone except Frank. He was still running numbers, still collecting protection, still making good money, but not great money, not buy your mother a house in the suburbs money, not never worrying about anything again money. And then Frank met someone, a U.S. Army sergeant named Leslie Atkinson, stationed in Bangkok. They met at a bar in Harlem during Atkinson's leave. Atkinson had a proposition, pure heroin, straight from the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia. No middlemen, no Italian distributors taking their cut. Just Frank, Atkinson, and a supply chain that would make them both millionaires. Think about it, Atkinson said, leaning across the bar. You're Bumpy Johnson's number 2. You've got the infrastructure. You've got the respect. You've got the network. All you need is the product. Frank should have said no right there. Should have walked away. Should have remembered W. Hat Bumpy taught him, but instead, he said the 5 words that would destroy everything. Let me think about it. Frank wrestled with it. He knew it was wrong. Knew it violated everything Bumpy stood for. Knew if Bumpy found out, their relationship would be over, but Frank convinced himself he could compartmentalize it. He'd keep the heroin out of Harlem, sell it in Brooklyn, in Queens, in the Bronx, other neighborhoods, not his own. That way, he wasn't betraying Bumpy's code. That way, he could have both. The money and the respect, it was a lie. And deep down, Frank knew it. Boo. He told himself that lie anyway because the money was too tempting, because he was tired of watching other people get rich, because he thought he was smart enough to keep it hidden. Frank made his first try. To Bangkok. Atkinson introduced him to the suppliers. Frank saw the operation. Heroin packed into the coffins of dead American soldiers being shipped home from Vietnam. Brilliant, morbid, untucked. Hable, Customs didn't search the coffins. Nobody questioned the bodies of fallen heroes. It was the perfect smuggling route. Frank came back to Harlem with his first shipment. He sold it in the Bronx through intermediaries. Made more money than he'd made in months running numbers. And nobody knew. Not his crew. Not the competition. Not Bumpy. Or so he thought. W.H. Frank didn't know. What he couldn't have known was that Bumpy Johnson had eyes everywhere. And one of those eyes was a baggage handler at JFK Airport named Jerome, the same Jerome who'd warned Bum Pie about Tony Marone approaching Big Sam. Jerome saw Frank's shipment come through, saw the coffins, saw Frank's man pick them up, and later, Jerome was sitting in Bumpy's office avo. "The small's paradise, Mr. Johnson," Jerome said quietly. Frank's moving product, heroin, Vietnam route. Bumpy was silent for a long time. He didn't look surprised, didn't look angry, just like he'd been expecting this, but hoping he was wrong. "You sure?" Bumpy asked. "Positive. Saw it with my own eyes." Bumpy opened his desk drawer, pulled out money, handed it to Jerome. "You didn't see anything. You weren't there." "Understand?" "Yes, sir." After Jerome left, Bumpy sat alone in his office. He could have confronted Frank immediately. Could have ended it right there. That's what most men would have done. Cut out the cancer before it spreads. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. He wanted to see how far Frank would go. Wanted to see if Frank would stop himself. Wanted to see if years of teaching meant anything or if money was all that mattered. So Bumpy watched and waited. And Frank kept going. Frank made his second trip to Bangkok. Brought back more this time. Expanding. Adding bolder. Then again and again. Frank was moving serious weight. He'd set up distribution networks in 4 boroughs. He had street dealers he'd never met working for him. He was making millions of dollars a month, and he thought he was invisible. But Bumpy knew everything. Knew about the Bangkok trips. Knew about the coffin shipments. Knew about the Bronx distribution network. Knew about the dealers in Queens. Bumpy had photographs, flat manifests, names, everything. He could have destroyed Frank at any moment. One phone call to the NYPD and Frank would spend the rest of his life in prison. One word to the Italian families and Frank would disappear into the East River. But Bumpy didn't make that call, didn't say that word, because this wasn't about punishment. This was about disappointment. This was about watching someone you love destroy themselves. This was about giving them every chance to stop before it was too late. Fra. Nick was planning his biggest shipment yet. Enough heroin to flood New York. He was meeting with his Bangkok connection to finalize the details. That's when Bumpy made his move. Frank walked into Small's paradise like he did every Sunday night. He was wearing a custom suit, Italian leather shoes, a gold Rolex. He looked successful, confident, untouchable. He walked to the back too. Bumpy's private booth. Bumpy was already there, alone. No bodyguards, no lieutenants, just Bumpy sitting in the shadows, nursing a glass of cognac. "Boss," Frank said, smiling. "Good to see you." Bumpy didn't smile back, didn't stand, didn't shake Frank's hand, just gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Frank." The temperature in that booth dropped. Frank felt it. Immediately, something was wrong. He sat down slowly, his smile fading. "Everything okay?" Bumpy still didn't speak. He just reached inside his jacket, pulled out a manila envelope, and slid it across. "At the table." Frank stared at it. Didn't want to touch it. Knew whatever was inside would change everything. "Open it," Bumpy said quietly. His voice was so calm, it was terrifying. Frank opened the envelope with shaking hands. 3 photographs fell out. The first one, Frank at Saigon Airport, shaking hands with Leslie Atkinson. The second one, a coffin being loaded onto a cargo plane. Frank, standing in the background. The third one, Frank's distribution warehouse in the Bronx, bags of heroin stacked on a table. Frank's face went white, his mouth open, but no sound came out. His brain was screaming at him to explain, to lie, to do something, but he knew there was no point. Bumpy knew everything. Bumpy said, his voice still quiet. "I've known, Frank, every trip to Bangkok, every shipment, every dealer, every corner. I know it all." Frank finally found his voice. "Bumpy, I can explain. Don't." Bumpy's hand came up. "Don't insult me with lies. I taught you." Better than that. Silence filled the booth. The jukebox in the corner was playing something by Billie Holiday, but neither of them heard it. "I kept it out of Harlem," Frank said desperately. "I swear, Bumpy, not one bag sold in our neighborhood. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, but never Harlem. I kept the code." "You broke the code the moment you touched that poison." Bumpy's eyes were cold. "You think I care which neighborhood you're destroying? Those are still black communities, still our people. Still someone's son getting hugged. Still someone's daughter selling herself for a fix." Frank looked down at the table. Couldn't meet Bumpy's eyes. "You taught me everything." Bumpy continued. "I took you in when you had nothing. I showed you how to be more than just another hustler. I showed you how to lead with respect, how to protect your community, how to build something that lasts, and you threw it away for money." "I just wanted," Frank started. "You wanted to get rich." I know everyone wants to get rich, but there's a difference between getting rich and selling your soul. You chose the wrong one." Bumpy leaned forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You have hours to shut down your entire operation. Bangkok, Bronx, Queens, all of it. You're going to disappear the kilos you're planning to bring in, and you're going to stay out of Harlem permanently." Fra. Ank's eyes widened. "Bumpy, please. This is my home. My family's here. My whole life. Should have thought about that before you became a drug dealer." Bumpy's voice was ice. "Hours, Frank. After that, if I hear you're still moving product, if I see your face in Harlem, if I even hear your name in the wrong conversation, I won't call the police. I'll handle it myself. And why? You know I don't make threats. I make promises." Frank felt tears burning behind his eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Can I ask you something?" "What?" Why didn't you stop me sooner? Why did you let me keep going? Bumpy was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Frank would never forget. Because I wanted to believe you'd stopped yourself. I wanted to believe that years of teaching meant something, that loyalty meant something, that you were different. He paused. I was wrong. Bumpy stood up, buttoned his jacket. Goodbye, Frank. Don't come back. And just like that, it was over. Years of mentorship, years of brotherhood, years of being groomed to be Harlem's next king, gone. Frank Lucas sat alone in that booth after Bumpy left. The photograph still spread on the table, his hands still shaken, his whole world crumbling. He thought about ignoring Bumpy's warning. Thought about continuing the operation anyway. Thought about fighting back, but he knew better. Why? You don't fight Bumpy Johnson. You don't ignore Bumpy Johnson's warnings. If Bumpy said hours, you had minutes before hell came for you. Frank shut down the operation, made calls to Bangkok, canceled the shipment, closed the warehouse in the Bronx, walked away from hundreds of thousands of dollars in product. And Frank Lucas left Harlem. He moved to Teaneck, New Jersey, close enough to stay connected, far enough to respect Bumpy's order. For months, Frank stayed quiet, stayed out of the drug business, tried to figure out what to do with his life. Now that Harlem was close to him, and then Frank got phone call. Bumpy Johnson had collapsed at Wells' restaurant. Heart attack. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. Frank heard the news and felt so. Nothing break inside him. Not relief. Not freedom. Grief. Because despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite being cast out, Frank had loved Bumpy, and now Bumpy was gone, and Fran K would never get the chance to apologize, never get the chance to prove he could be better. Frank went to the funeral, stood in the back of the church, didn't approach the family. Didn't speak to anyone, just watched as they lowered the king of Harlem into the ground. After the service, Frank walked to a payphone, called his Bangkok connection. I'm back in business, Frank said. Rifle a shipment because without Bumpy, there was no code anymore. Without Bumpy, there was no one to answer to. Without Bumpy, Frank was free to become exactly what he'd always wanted. To be rich, powerful, feared, and for years, Frank Lucas built an empire. He became the biggest heroin dealer in New York, made millions, lived in a mansion, drove Rolls Royces, wore chain. He logged hosts to boxing matches. He became everything Bumpy had warned him not to become. A parasite, a kingpin, a legend, but legends don't last forever. The D finally caught Frank, arrested him. With millions in cash and enough heroin to kill half of New York, Frank was sentenced to years in federal prison. His empire collapsed overnight. His money disappeared. His family turned their backs on him. And Frank Lucas, the man who thought he was smarter than everyone, the man who betrayed the greatest teacher he'd ever had, sat in a prison cell and finally understood what Bumpy had tried to tell him. The money wasn't worth it. The power wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth losing your soul. Frank was interviewed by a reporter. The reporter asked him if he had any regrets. Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Bumpy Johnson told me once that the moment you put poison in your own neighborhood, you stop being a king and you become a parasite. I didn't believe him, thought I was smarter, thought I could have both, the money and the respect. He paused. I was wrong. And I spent every day since Bumpy died wishing I could go back to that night at Small's Paradise, wishing I could look him in the eye and say, I'm sorry, wishing I could have been the man he wanted me to be, but I can't. And that's a heavier sentence than years. Frank Lucas was released from prison after serving years. He lived quietly in New Jersey until his death, but he never went back to Harlem. Not because he wasn't allowed, because he knew what Bumpy had known all along. Once you betray your own people, you can never really go home. Bumpy Johnson died believing Frank Lucas would be Harlem's next king. Instead, Frank became everything Bumpy fought against his entire life. A cautionary tale. A warning, proof that no amount of money is worth the price of your integrity. And that lesson, the one Frank learned too late, is the real legacy Bumpy Johnson left behind, not the empire he built, not the wars he won, but the code he lived by. Protect your people, respect your community, and never ever sell your soul. If this story about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of ambition moved you, hit that subscribe button, drop a like if you understand that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Share this with someone who needs to. Know that the greatest teachers aren't the ones who give you everything you want. They're the ones who show you who you really are. Leave a comment below. Would you have made the same choice as FR? Onk and hit that notification bell because next time, we're telling the story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's meeting with 6 mob bosses and walked out with a deal that changed Oregon. Ice crime forever. You don't want to miss.